Sometimes the most dangerous place for a child is not out in society, but right inside the home. Their parents believe they have protected them so well, just because he came home early once. A father uncovered a truth that, had he arrived even one day later, might have meant his child's childhood would never be whole again. And this story will make you ask yourself, do we truly understand what is happening behind the doors of our own homes? Daniel Harper was used to coming home when everything had already fallen silent. Back-to-back flights, non-stop meetings, and a phone that never stopped vibrating in his pocket. That had been his life for years. That evening was supposed to be no different from hundreds of evenings before it. His flight from Seattle back to California was canceled due to bad weather. Daniel sighed, closed his laptop, and in that rare moment, he decided not to return to the hotel. Let's go home, he thought. No emails, no calls. Just going home. On the way back, Daniel stopped by a familiar pizza place. He picked up a few cans of soda and a small bouquet, not for any special occasion, but simply because it suddenly occurred to him how long it had been since he'd done something unexpected for his children. He imagined Ethan running to the door first, Lucas rambling excitedly about a soccer match at school, and little Mia clinging tightly to his leg, giggling like she always did. An ordinary evening. Warm. Truly what family was meant to feel like. But the moment the front door closed behind him, Daniel felt that something wasn't right. The house was too quiet. Not the quiet of sleep, but a tense, rigid silence, as if the entire house were holding its breath. The living room lights were still on, but there was no sound from the TV, no laughter, no small feet running across the wooden floor. Daniel slowed his steps, the instincts of a man who had steered hundreds of major deals suddenly warning him of a risk he couldn't yet name. And then, from the end of the hallway, a figure appeared. Rosa Martinez, the woman who had been with his family since the days when his ex-wife was still alive, the woman who had held Mia in her arms when the baby was still red and newborn, the woman who never raised her voice, never complained, never involved herself in the private matters of the household. But now, Rosa did not look like herself. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling, her eyes were filled with panic, as if she had just witnessed something beyond what a person could endure. She almost rushed straight up to Daniel and, before he could say a word, urgently pressed a finger to his lips. "Please, don't say anything," she whispered, her voice breaking with fear. Daniel froze. In that instant, he understood that he had just stepped into a moment that would divide his life into two parts. Before knowing the truth, and after being unable to pretend he had never seen it. And on the other side of that wall, perhaps his children were waiting for a father who had been gone for far too long to finally make it back in time. Rosa gently pulled Daniel close against the hallway wall. The yellow light spilling out from the living room stretched their shadows across the wooden floor like invisible cracks. Before Daniel could ask anything, he heard the sound. Children's voices, but not laughter. They were dry, trembling recitations, as if each word were being forced out of their throats by fear. A distorted rhythm, too even, too rigid, nothing like the way children usually read. Daniel's heart tightened. He leaned forward, peering through the narrow gap in the wall, and in that moment, everything inside him shattered. Ethan, Lucas, and Mia were kneeling on the living room floor, not sitting, not standing, kneeling. Books open in front of them, hands placed neatly on their knees. Their shoulders were stiff, their backs unnaturally straight, a posture that appears only when a child is too afraid to move. Lucas misread a word. A cold voice cut in sharply. "Reread it." Daniel followed the direction of that voice. Lauren Mitchell was sitting on the sofa, back straight, legs crossed, phone in her hand. The glow from the screen reflected on her face, calm, indifferent, as if what stood before her were not 3 children but objects arranged incorrectly. "You haven't finished your lesson. That means you don't get dinner," Lauren said evenly. "Lazy children don't need dinner." Mia bit her lip. Her tiny hands trembled. A tear fell onto the page, but she hurriedly wiped it away, as if even crying were a mistake. Daniel felt a sharp pain tear through his chest. He had once thought Lauren was simply strict. He had once believed that this was just discipline, but now there was no way left to justify it. This was not discipline. This was cold control, wrapped in the appearance of false order. Rosa stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm so tightly it shook. "She's only like this when you're not home," Rosa whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "She tells them they're useless, says they're a burden, and says that if they tell you, you won't need them anymore." Daniel couldn't breathe. Fragments of memory came rushing back. Ethan's unusual silences, Lucas flinching at loud noises, Mia always apologizing, even when she had done nothing wrong. He had seen all of it, but he had refused to look honestly. Just then, Ethan slowly lifted his head. The boy's eyes met his father's, hidden in the shadows. For a split second, Daniel wanted to step out, to shout, to tear everything apart. But Ethan didn't cry out. He only looked at him. Then he immediately lowered his head again, as if he had learned that silence was the only way to survive. And in that moment, Daniel understood the most painful truth of all. It wasn't that he didn't love his children. It was that he had been gone for too long to protect them. Daniel was still standing in the hallway's darkness, but the feeling was completely different now. He was no longer the man who had just walked into his home with a box of pizza in his hands. He was standing at the fragile boundary of a truth that could shatter everything he had ever believed. The sound of reading continued in the living room, steady, mechanical, without emotion. Each word felt like a knife cutting into Daniel's chest. Rosa released her grip on his sleeve and stepped back half a step as if she no longer had the strength to stand. She leaned against the wall, her voice hoarse from holding everything in for far too long. "You don't know, sir," she said very softly. "At first, it was just harsh words. Then there was no food. Then locked doors. Then threats." Daniel turned to look at her. In the dim light, he saw her eyes swollen and red, not the eyes of a housekeeper, but of someone who had helplessly watched 3 children grow up in fear day after day. "She tells them that you'll believe her more," Rosa continued. "She says children lying is normal, and if they open their mouths, they'll be sent somewhere else." Daniel closed his eyes. Each sentence fell into his mind, pressing down on memories he had tried to ignore. He remembered the silent dinners, the short, clipped answers, the hugs that no longer felt natural. He had seen the signs, but he chose the safest explanation. They're probably just not used to it yet. The truth was, he had chosen to believe what required him to face the least. In the living room, Lauren stood up. Her heels struck the wooden floor, dry, cold. She ordered Lucas to kneel straighter. Her voice was not loud, not angry, but strong enough to freeze the entire room. Daniel opened his eyes. He saw Lucas's hands trembling as he tried to keep the book from slipping to the floor. He saw Mia repeatedly glancing toward the staircase as if afraid something worse was waiting upstairs. He saw Ethan, the oldest, forcing himself to be a pillar for his siblings, while he himself was terrified. In that moment, Daniel suddenly understood a cruel truth. His children had learned to grow up through fear, not through love. Rosa trembled as she pulled an old phone from the pocket of her apron. "Please, look at this," she whispered. "I had no other choice. Daniel took the phone. The screen lit up, a short video, shaky, blurry, imperfect, but clear enough. Lauren's voice, the cruel words, a hard shove that sent Lucas falling onto the carpet, the sound of Mia choking back her sobs. Daniel didn't rewind it. He didn't need to watch anymore, because in that moment he didn't just see the truth about the woman he had married. He saw a far more painful truth, that he had not been there when his children needed him the most. Footsteps echoed from the upstairs staircase. Not fast, not hurried, just steady, confident clicks of heels, as if the person descending fully believed she still held control over everything in this house. The three children froze instantly. Mia instinctively tightened her grip on Lucas's hand. Ethan straightened, subtly stepping in front of his siblings, even though he himself was trembling. The reflex happened so quickly that Daniel felt a sharp pain in his chest. His children had learned to protect one another, instead of turning to their father. Lauren appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing a neat jacket, her hair carefully brushed, her face calm, as if nothing had happened. When her eyes met Daniel's, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, very briefly, then vanished. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice light, smooth, familiar. "You're home early?" That was the same voice Daniel had heard at charity galas, in conversations with friends, in promises of a perfect family. But now he could hear something he had never noticed before. There was no concern, only control. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself squarely in front of his children. "Lauren," he said slowly, each word carefully weighed. "We need to talk." She smiled faintly, her gaze sliding toward Rosa. "Now? Or is it that you're letting the housekeeper put ideas in your head?" Rosa took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, she did not lower her head. "It's not about planting anything," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It's the truth." Lauren snapped back toward her, eyes sharp and cold. "The truth?" she repeated, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Children exaggerate, you know that. They need discipline." Daniel felt a surge of heat rise in his chest. "Discipline," he repeated. "It is not forcing children to kneel for hours. It is not denying them food. And it is certainly not threatening to take them away from their father." Lauren let out a short, dry laugh. "So you believe them over me? You believe a housekeeper over your own wife?" Daniel did not answer right away. He pulled the phone from his pocket, turned on the screen, pressed play. Lauren's voice filled the living room, sharp, cold, completely unmasked. The image shook, blurred, but clear enough to be undeniable. Lauren froze. The color drained from her face, her hands clenched, nails digging into her palms. "That was just a moment when I lost control," she said quickly, her voice beginning to rise. "They pushed me to my limit." Daniel stepped forward once more. "They are children," he said, his voice low but steady. "And children need love to grow, not fear to survive." The three children pressed closer against his back. Small hands clutched his jacket tightly as if holding on to the only thing that still felt safe. In that moment, Daniel knew there was no turning back. He had seen the truth, and this time, he would not look away. No one said another word for several seconds after that. The room sank into a very different kind of silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of a truth that had just been torn wide open. Lauren was the first to break it. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice dropping, no longer pretending to be gentle. "You're destroying this family." Daniel looked straight at her. Family, a word that had once filled him with pride. Now it sounded like a hollow shell. "No," he replied replied slowly. This family was destroyed a long time ago. I'm just the last one to realize it. Lauren turned away and walked toward the stairs. Her heels struck the floor more hurriedly now, no longer controlled as before. The upstairs bedroom door slammed shut, leaving behind a house that felt as though it had just weathered a storm. Daniel let out a long, heavy breath. Then he turned back. The three children were still standing there, pressed close together, as if the moment he looked away, everything might collapse again. Mia looked up at him, eyes red and swollen, her voice trembling. "Dad, will she come back?" The question pierced Daniel more deeply than any accusation ever could. He knelt and wrapped his arms around all three of them, not hurried, not dramatic, just a tight embrace as if he were trying to make up for every day he had been gone. "No," he whispered. "I'm here now. And from now on, no one will ever make you afraid again." Lucas let out a sob. Ethan bit his lip, trying to be strong, but tears still fell. Mia buried her face in her father's chest, broken apologies spilling out as a deeply ingrained habit. Daniel closed his eyes. In that moment, he no longer thought about the company, the stocks, or the meetings waiting for him. He thought of only one thing. If he didn't change from this moment on, then all of his success meant nothing. Rosa stood nearby, her hands clasped together, her shoulders trembling slightly. Daniel looked up at her, not with the eyes of an employer, but of a father who had just been awakened. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not staying silent." Rosa shook her head, tears falling. "I only did what anyone should do. For children." That night Daniel did not sleep. He lay in bed with the three children asleep around him, their breathing still uneven from nightmares that had not yet faded. He stared at the ceiling, listening to each small breath, and for the first time in many years, he felt afraid. Not afraid of losing money, not afraid of losing his reputation, but afraid that he had almost lost his children. Forever. And in that quiet darkness, Daniel made a decision he knew would change everything. Starting tomorrow, he would no longer be just the provider for his family. He would be their protector. The next morning came very slowly. There was no alarm clock, no meeting schedule. Only pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, and the three children still curled up beside Daniel, as if the moment they left his arms, the world would become dangerous again. Daniel woke first. He lay still, afraid to move too much, listening to each small breath. Mia frowned slightly in her sleep. Lucas murmured something unintelligible, and Ethan, the oldest, still held his sister's hand tightly, even while dreaming. In that moment, Daniel understood. Safety does not come from locked doors, but from the feeling that someone is always there. Lauren left the house in silence a few hours later. No arguments, no pleading, just the sound of tires rolling down the driveway, leaving behind a cold emptiness, but a necessary one. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. There were no more cold commands, no more watchful eyes, but there was no laughter yet, only a pause, like the moment after a storm when everything is still wondering, are we truly safe now? The days that followed were not easy. Mia startled awake every night, bursting into tears from dreams of being locked in a dark room. Lucas pressed himself against the wall whenever someone raised their voice, even when Daniel was calling him to dinner. Ethan apologized for things that weren't his fault, apologizing for spilling a glass of water, apologizing when his sister cried, apologizing for not protecting the family. Daniel was there, every time, without fail. He sat by Mia's bed until she fell asleep again. He learned to speak more slowly, more gently. He knelt to meet his children at eye level, not to give orders, but to listen. And Rosa was still there, She cooked breakfast. She read stories before bedtime. She patiently listened to the shattered fragments of memories the children were finally brave enough to share. No one called her the housekeeper anymore. In this home, she was safe. Little by little, the house began to change. Bedroom doors were no longer locked. The dinner table filled with conversation, hesitant at first, then gradually more natural. One Saturday morning, Daniel burned the pancakes, and for the first time in a long while, the children burst into laughter. The laughter wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. Daniel stood there, watching his children, and for the first time he understood what he had missed for so many years. True wealth is not having everything. It is not losing what matters most. This house had once been built with money. Now it was being rebuilt with presence, patience, and love. And that was the true beginning of the story. Time does not erase every wound, but it teaches people how to live with them more gently. Several weeks had passed since the day Lauren left that house. No more heels were echoing through the hallway, no more watchful eyes forcing the children to lower their heads. But fear did not disappear overnight. It remained quietly, like a faint shadow that only those who have lived through it can truly understand. Daniel recognized this clearly. There were afternoons when he sat working at the desk in the living room, and Lucas would still glance toward the staircase whenever he heard an unfamiliar sound. There were moments when Mia, in the middle of coloring, would suddenly stop and ask very softly, "Dad, do we have to go somewhere?" Those questions were not spoken loudly, but they carried an entire suffocated past within them. Daniel did not rush to answer with empty promises. He knelt, looked straight into his child's eyes, and said slowly, "No, this is your home, and I will not let anyone take it away again." Ethan stood nearby listening. The boy said nothing, but his eyes softened slightly. Daniel knew that for Ethan, peace did not come from words, but from whether those words were truly kept. The house began to find a new rhythm, not perfect, not always joyful, but real. There were evenings when the family sat around the dinner table, conversations broken by stretches of silence. No one forced anyone to speak. Rosa set out an extra plate of pastries, as if silently reminding them, "Here, no one is forgotten." Daniel learned to accept that. Healing is not about erasing memories, but about creating enough new ones so that pain no longer takes up all the space. A month later, Daniel held a birthday party for Mia. No big party, no unfamiliar guests, just a homemade cake, crooked candles, and silly paper hats. Mia blew out the candles, then turned and hugged her father, whispering, "I like this birthday." Daniel's throat tightened. Not because of the words were extraordinary, but because they were simple and safe. Rosa stood behind them, smiling quietly. She did not need to be thanked again, because she knew that what she had done was not heroic. It was not turning away when children were hurting. That night, as Daniel stood alone in the hallway that had once held the family's worst memories, he suddenly realized the yellow light there no longer felt cold. It no longer illuminated fear. It was simply a light guiding the way to the bedroom where his children were sleeping peacefully. And Daniel came to understand something very slowly, very deeply. Peace does not come on its own. It is the result of a courageous choice, the choice to stand on the side of truth, even when it hurts. Their story did not end with a miracle. It continued through ordinary days, and it was those ordinary days that were the most precious of all. A year passed, quietly, without noise or display. Daniel Harper's life slowed down in a way he had never imagined before. Mornings no longer began with packed meeting schedules, but with the sound of small footsteps running down the hallway. Evenings no longer ended with unread emails, but with unfinished stories told beside a bed. The house, once a symbol of success, had now become the place where Daniel relearned how to stay. Ethan was a little taller. Lucas no longer flinched at the sound of doors closing. Mia had stopped apologizing for no reason. These changes were so small that outsiders might never notice them, but to Daniel, they were quiet victories. One spring evening, the whole family sat around the dinner table. No grand celebration, no blaring lights, just an ordinary meal, half-finished plates, conversations interrupted by children's laughter. Daniel looked around the table. 3 children, Rosa, and himself, no longer feeling that something was missing. He lifted his glass of water, his voice lowering. "I used to think I had to build many things to keep you safe," he said slowly. "But it turns out what you needed was simply someone who wouldn't turn away when the truth appeared." Ethan was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "If it weren't for Rosa, we'd probably still be scared." Rosa quickly turned away, her eyes filling with tears. Daniel placed his hand over hers, gentle but firm. "No," he said. "If it weren't for courage, none of us would be here today." That night, as Daniel went one by one to wish his children good night in the same room, a habit they still hadn't given up, he lingered longer than usual. Looking at their peaceful faces in sleep, he suddenly realized painful memories would never disappear completely. They would remain, like scars, not to remind them of the pain, but to remind them that they had survived. Daniel stepped out into the hallway. The soft yellow light fell across the wooden floor. It was no longer a place of secrets, no longer a place of fear, just a familiar passage leading to rooms where people were waiting for him. He stood by the window looking out at the quiet street, and for the first time in many years, he clearly understood something money had never taught him. Money can build a house. Power can create a shell. But only love and truth can keep a family together. In the eyes of the world, Daniel Harper was still a wealthy man, but only here, in this house, did he truly become rich enough. And perhaps that was the most beautiful ending a true life story could have. Some stories do not end when the screen goes dark. They stay, with tiny, very ordinary moments. Daniel Harper understands that better than anyone. One late afternoon, he stood in the kitchen washing dishes, looking through the glass door into the backyard. Lucas was fumbling with his shoelaces. Mia sat flat on the grass, and Ethan stood nearby, patiently waiting until his sibling was done before running off again. The scene was so ordinary that if this were Daniel from a year ago, he probably wouldn't have noticed. But now, he saw it clearly. He saw a child who was no longer afraid of making mistakes. He saw a child willing to slow down for someone else. And he saw a family learning to trust again, little by little. None of them had forgotten what had happened. They refused to let it define the future. Daniel understood that abuse does not always leave bruises. Some wounds exist only in the way a child apologizes too much, in eyes that constantly search for permission, in the vague fear that love can be taken away at any moment. And he understood a truth that weighed heavily on his heart. The most dangerous things often happen very quietly. They hide behind a polished appearance, behind words that sound like they are for the child, behind explanations that adults easily accept because they are convenient. Rosa once said to him, very late one night after the children had fallen asleep, "Children don't need perfect adults. They need adults who are brave enough to look straight at the truth." Daniel did not reply at the time, but he knew that sentence would stay with him for a long time. Perhaps, out there, No one will ever see this story. There will be no headlines, no praise. But every night, when Daniel turns off the lights and hears his children whisper, "Good night, Dad," he knows that some victories do not need witnesses. This story does not say that every father must sacrifice everything. It simply reminds us of something simple, but easily forgotten. Sometimes loving your family is not about doing more. It is about daring to stop, to look closely, and not turn away when what you see hurts. If you are watching this story, perhaps you are a father, a mother, or simply an adult who was once a child. And perhaps somewhere in your memory, there was also a moment when you wished someone had noticed sooner. If so, then this story does not end with Daniel Harper. It begins with the way we choose to listen to the things no one says out loud. There are evenings when, after the house has grown quiet again, Daniel Harper still stands in the hallway for a long time. Not because he is afraid, but because he is remembering. Remembering the moment he once walked through this very place without knowing. Just beyond that wall, his children were learning to hold their breath to survive. He no longer blames himself with harsh words. He understands that what matters is not how late he arrived, but he chose to stay when the truth appeared. Ethan, Lucas, and Mia will grow up. They will carry memories that are not always easy to put into words, but they will also carry something else. The memory of the day when the one adult who could protect them did not turn away. The wounds do not disappear completely. They become scars, reminders, no longer controllers. And perhaps that is the most honest form of healing. Daniel once believed that being a father meant providing enough. Now he understands that being a father means daring to take responsibility for the things he does not want to see. Because true love, it is not always gentle. Sometimes it forces us to break the beautiful image we ourselves have built. This story does not say that every family has a clearly defined villain. It only whispers something tiny, but very real. Some pains never cry out for help, and some children are simply hoping that adults will listen before it is too late. If you have watched this story until this moment, it may not be by chance. Perhaps you are a father, a mother. Maybe you are someone who had to grow up too soon. Or perhaps you are simply someone asking, "Am I truly seeing the people I love?" Daniel Harper's story ends here, but its message does not. Because somewhere, right now, there are still doors left slightly ajar, and children waiting for someone brave enough to step inside. Deep Life Tales does not tell stories to judge. We tell them to remind one another that sometimes what changes an entire life begins simply with choosing not to look away. If this story touched you, even just a little, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about. And if you want to continue walking alongside real-life stories where emotions are respected and truth is listened to, subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Because there are stories that simply by being told have already begun to save someone.